Over these last days, the question's been asked, what's the difference between a charm, an amulet, and a talisman? And this has elicited some very interesting responses. But to make a little summation, perhaps it can be said that a charm is worn because we want to charm people, or we want to invite into our life good things, good responses, admiration, and the like. And we wear an amulet when we want to ward off evil or bad things. And we wear a talisman because it could be said to be like an icon, like the Christian cross or the Om symbol, or a gift given by our chosen ideal, or a picture of that chosen ideal, or a relic like a part of the Buddha's tooth, or something of that nature. Because that icon is representative of and connects us to something deep and permanent within ourselves. So there's a reminder of a story that perhaps can take us deeper to answer a more important question. And it's that story about the king who had an only son, who had been groomed to take over the kingdom. He'd been trained in the way of the court. He'd learned diplomacy. His horsemanship was unsurpassed, as was his swordsmanship. He was groomed in all ways that would fit him to become a monarch of a kingdom. But it came for the time for the king to abdicate and hand over to his son. So he called his son, the prince, to him, and he said, "Before I hand over this kingdom to you, you must pass a test that I myself underwent, my father before me, and his father before him, to see your worthiness to take over this vast, vast kingdom." The king said, "Down in the dungeon of this palace, there is a fierce tiger. You must go and face this tiger." Now the prince's face went white. His legs became jelly. If there was one thing in all of life he feared, it was tigers. He had been on a hunt with his father in his youth on the back of a great elephant when he'd seen a man torn to death in the jaws of one of these great animals. Since that time, he was full of fear of these magnificent creatures. That night, when the prince lay down to rest, there was no rest for him. He tossed and turned and sweated until he could bear it no longer. He got up from his bed and dressed himself in the garb of an ordinary man, a peasant's garments, and he slipped quietly out of the palace and out of the palace gates. He took a path that he knew not where it was going to take him, and the day was long, and he was tired, hungry, and thirsty. But he spied a farmhouse not far distant, and so he made his way. When the door was answered by the farmer, even though he was wearing the garb of an ordinary man, the farmer recognized him immediately, because his visage was almost identical to that of the king himself. He was welcomed in and given hospitality, food, and a bed for the night, and invited to stay as long as he wished. But the farmer did ask him, "Why are you abroad in disguise?" And the prince, just hedging away from this question, said, "I have a problem that has not been solved." That night, when the prince was laying down to sleep, he heard sound outside, and he got up and looked out of the window. And there in the dark, he saw glistening 2 great yellow eyes. In the morning, he spoke to the farmer and told him what he had experienced. And the farmer said, "Oh yes, we often have tigers coming to our garden to seek food by way of our chickens and our geese." Again the prince's legs went a jelly. He started to sweat. And even though the farmer begged him to stay as long as he wished, the prince hastened after giving thanks and made his way off down the road. In that day, he came to the very ends of his father's realm. But there, at the edges of this realm, there was a fort that was inhabited by a colonel and a troop of soldiers who kept guard over the parameters of the kingdom. And again, his visage so alike his father, as soon as he approached the fort, he was recognized, even though he was wearing simple peasant's garb, and invited in by the colonel, and again hospitality around the campfire at night. And then, as they were around the campfire telling stories, the colonel said, "You've come just at a good time, because tomorrow we're going on a hunt, a tiger hunt." Well, the prince was again overcome with fear and trepidation. So the very next morning, giving thanks for the hospitality, again he hastened on his way. But now he'd entered another realm, another kingdom. But we know the way of such things. Word very quickly arrived at the palace of the king of this adjoining kingdom that a prince of the neighboring realm was approaching. So even though he was dressed in simple garb, an entourage came out to welcome him, bring him into the palace, introduce him to the king of that place. He was feted and fed and invited to stay as long as he wished. Now, as he was returning to his bedchamber that night, as fate would have it, coming down the corridor towards him was the daughter of the king of that realm. Immediately the prince set eyes on her. He fell deeply and wholly and totally in love. He was besotted. He could think of nothing else that night. In the morning, he went to the king and he said, "Even though I feel unworthy, I wish to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The king readily agreed, saying, "Yes, you can have her in wedlock, but first you must ask her if she is in agreement with this marriage. She is presently sitting by the pond in the garden. Go, greet her and ask for her hand." The prince made his way out into the garden, and there was the princess sitting resplendent in silken garments by the pond, and beside her, laying at her feet, was her magnificent pet tiger. As soon as the prince set eyes on this creature, again his legs went to jelly. The sweat began to pour from his brow and his back, and whilst his eyes wanted to go to this beautiful being in whom he had fallen totally in love, he could not draw himself away from the creature, the great glistening creature with its yellow eyes. He turned and walked back into the palace, and giving thanks to the king, he said, "I cannot return until I have solved the problem that has beset me." And so the prince left and made his way back to his own kingdom. He went before his father and apologized, getting down on his knees. "I am so ashamed and sorry." But then he stood up and he said, "I am ready. I will face the test. I will face the tiger." All of those who were in the court at that time cheered, and the king ordered that the ivory-handled sacred dagger be bought and put into the hands of the prince. When it was placed in his hand, he was guided down, down, down into the bowels of the palace. There in front of him was an iron door with a grill. When he looked inside, there was the great beast pacing back and forth and back and forth. The door was opened, and the prince entered, and the door was closed behind him. He stood and watched the great animal as it eyeballed him as it paced back and forth. And just as the prince was about to raise the sacred dagger, the tiger came over to him, rubbed itself against the side of his legs, and rolled over so that it could be fondled in its belly. Of course, the king and his entourage were outside the dungeon cell and cheered and opened the door to congratulate the prince, and the tiger followed at his heels. The king explained what that test was, and we ourselves can imagine the words that were exchanged between them. But we know the end of the story. The prince triumphantly returned to the neighboring kingdom, where he claimed his bride, who readily accepted his proposal. With great festivity, celebrations, they married. The question that arises out of this story relative to this talisman, this icon that we wear, that's representative of and a connection to something deep, permanent within ourselves. Now, from this story, we can say that the saying that arises is that love conquers all, or love conquers all fear. But love does not suffice for us. What is this power, this force within us that is greater than fear, that allows us to perform acts that are beyond even physical imagining, or overcome the deepest of our conditioning that shackles us, enchains us? What is this force? In this story and many others, the power of love. But this does not suffice for us. What does this talisman, this icon, in so many different forms that is worn to represent, connect us to this that is within us, permanent, unchanging, ever ready? What is this force in us? Perhaps you still perceive it as love. But even unconditional love is only the highest point of the creative force. What we seek to name is beyond this.
It's a bit like we step from our physical body of who we believe we are into letting all that go and like stepping into a doorway of who we really are. And we drop that, and then once we're there, then everything kind of comes together.
Absolutely like so. Absolutely so.
Mm.
For me, it's like you experience that amazing force of love and energy, and then you try to interpret it. And when you try to interpret it, you can only think in human terms, and you think of it as love. But really something much beyond what we could understand.
It is. But we're endeavoring to give it a name, because when we give it a name, we claim it. Then we don't need charms, amulets, and icons.
That's what brings us here. It's what brings us here every week. It's what draws us in life all the time, and it's like the talisman is what we come to inside of us to draw us on, and it's like the charm and the amulet are all the same. They're both the same. They're pulling it to you as well as warding it off. It's there all in one.
Absolutely so.
Yes. And it's to find that within ourselves.
Yes. Yes. So this is the purpose of our coming together, isn't it? To draw, to evoke, to allow us to find it, to connect with it, name it, claim it, live it as we can, as we can. Thank you, thank you.
So it's like claiming